In this lecture, we'll consider a basic ethical orientation. Traditionally, in ethics, there are three fundamental approaches to deciding whether an action is morally right or wrong. You can consider an action from a point of view of its results or consequences. Consider, for example, taking a walk in the park. Suppose we focus on the results of the action. Say you meet somebody and you fall in love. This would be as a result of taking a walk in the park, in a sense. This would correspond in ethics to the consequence-based, consequentialist, or if you like the more technical word, the teleological form of ethics. Telos means the result or consequence. Now, suppose on the other hand that you were not interested in the consequences, but your reasons for, say, taking a walk in the park. You took the walk to cool down from an argument with your parents or, say, your wife or husband. Now you're focusing on your reasons for taking a walk, not the consequences. There is also an analog to this. In ethical terms, this would be based on the duty-based, or to use the more technical term, the deontological approach to ethics. Deontological means based upon a duty or a principle. But there is a third way to approach ethics, and that's what we'll be concerned with in this particular lecture. Go back to taking a walk in the park. Say you walked in the park because it was your goal. You had an overriding good that you wanted, and let's just say it was health. So you thought that by to keep on taking walks, that would keep you healthy. Now, these overall goals, we might call them human excellences, are what are termed virtues. Health certainly would qualify as one. Wealth is a little bit more controversial. Usually, at least having enough wealth to avoid poverty is thought of to be a virtue. Fairly universally, character traits such as courage, self-control, generosity, being fair, being well-tempered, these are character virtues or human excellences. Now, when you think of right and wrong in the moral sense, in terms of how they stand in relationship to these human goods, then you're doing virtue ethics. It has certain advantages. It has the advantage of ranging over a great many actions through one particular understanding of a person's trait or character. You don't have to so much care about action by action, judgment, or policy by policy. No, it consolidates all of this, and you can consider simply your own traits or the traits of another person, whether they're in fact fair or whether in fact well-tempered, etc. Now, as far as the background goes, whether we look at the roots of philosophical discussion in ancient China, India, or Greece, we find discussions of virtues and their relation to human happiness. Take, for example, ancient China. Confucius, prime influence. He thought the master virtue was, now pardon my pronunciation, as I certainly do not pronounce Chinese accurately, but something along the lines of Ren. It's usually translated as kindness. This was a master virtue because in order to become fully human, you needed to have Ren, or kindness. If we go to India, the Pali Canon, ancient source of material on the Buddha, we find that he isolated the social virtues of generosity, compassion, forgiveness. Now, insofar as we are ensconced in a Western tradition still, better or for worse, we will take probably the primary historical influence in virtue ethics in the West, and that is Aristotle. So we'll be considering Aristotle as a model for the virtue ethics perspective. Then we'll also consider how it applies, of course, to business. Now, you see there a bust of Aristotle. This one is probably fairly accurate, from the Museum of Naples. A book called Nicomachean Ethics is attributed to him, called Nicomachean, named after his son, to whom it was dedicated, Nicomachus. For the last 2 millennia has been a philosophical classic. It's read as one of the primary serious attempts to answer the question of what is human happiness. And very much connects to the virtues, because Aristotle thought that to be happy, you had to have virtues. In particular, you needed certain moral virtues. He was well aware that luck and good fortune played a role, but in the long run at least, having certain character traits, which he thought were developed largely by habits, were the conditions of a happy life, a life lived well. Aristotle had a very compelling way of deciding which character traits were most needed for human happiness. He considered what he saw as unavoidable features of the human condition, things that we couldn't really go through even a month or two of life without experiencing. Take fear and confidence. Would it be possible to live a life, or even some part of it, without having some of these feelings? Probably not. But even if you could, would you want to have a life where you didn't feel some fear or confidence? It probably would not be a good idea at all. A little bit of fear felt when driving a car fast, or skiing, or let's say underwater exploring, or for that matter walking through a dangerous neighborhood, is useful. Fear renders us more alert. If we're somewhat fearful, we're alerted to protect ourselves and the people, of course, we love and care for. Same goes for confidence. People with no confidence are in a sorry state. They'd scarcely risk the chance of getting out of bed in the morning without some confidence. Having too much confidence, on the other hand, is similar to having no fear at all. It would lead to reckless behavior. The key point here is that Aristotle realized that there are basic feelings that we can either feel too much or too little. The way to virtue then lies in finding the mean, or the proper middle course between the two extremes. In the case of fear and confidence, the middle or mean is usually called courage, although we might as well call it self-assurance or bravery, or even having nerve. An extreme deficiency of fear generally goes under the name of recklessness. An extreme excess of fear would usually be called cowardice or perhaps timidity. So basing his search for the human virtues on basic feelings, sensations, and moods, which are part of the human condition and which we can feel too much or too little, Aristotle arrived at a collection of basic human virtues which he saw as conditions of happiness. Let's consider this model of virtue a little bit further through the following two charts. In this first chart, we see that vices are both on the left and the right side of the blue arc as deficiencies and excesses. If the emotion at issue again is fear, then the deficiency, utter fearlessness, amounts to recklessness. And the other side, if there is an excess of fear, then the person succumbs to cowardice. The virtue lies in between the mean and goes under the name of courage, as we've stated, or bravery, or perhaps having nerve. In general, knowing how, when, and to what extent to take risks would be this virtue, courage. The second chart lists how this deficiency means excess relation pertains for some of the virtues that Aristotle discusses. As you can read from the chart, fear and confidence tend to function as opposites, as we've seen. In the reverse from fear, too much confidence leads to recklessness and too little to cowardice. A very different concern is raised by the pleasures of taste and touch. Why taste and touch? Generally, pleasure taken through the so-called distant senses, sight, hearing, and smell, do not raise moral concerns. Consider a magnificent painting, hearing a moving symphony, or smelling a perfume. They are not likely to create a moral problem. Matters are different with pleasures which peak through the senses of taste and touch. With these so-called contact senses, not distant senses, that the pleasures of eating, drinking, and sex arise. Aristotle was not a prude. A deficiency, not enough, of the pleasures of touch and taste regarding eating, drinking, and lovemaking, he understood, makes for a dull life. On the chart, it would be summed up by the word insensibility. But excesses, it probably comes as no surprise, can be a problem. One chocolate eclair is fine, eating 12 of them, one after another, is something else. A glass of wine may complement a meal, a bottle of bourbon every day spells trouble. Anger and shame are also thought, as you can see from the chart, to be part of the human experience. They are also subject to deficiencies and excesses. You can be too angry or not angry enough. You can also be too shameful or not shameful enough. The last virtue on the list is justice. The issue here is giving people what they deserve. Consider parents supporting children. Suppose parents with the financial wherewithal offer no support to their children. They're deficient, and in the sorting out of virtues of vices, they are actually vicious. On the other side would be the overindulgent parent. Parents who dote upon their children and satisfy any whim they might have. They also miss the mark. Without some degree of toleration of delayed satisfaction, children will become ill-equipped for adult life. Excessive indulgence would harm the child in the long run. Again, a mean needs to be sought. There are a few more things we need to consider even in this brief introduction of using Aristotle as a model for virtue theory. First, Aristotle was quite aware that finding the moral mean was different from an arithmetic mean. Regardless who asked the question, the arithmetic mean between 2 and 4 is 3, between 10 and 30 is 20, between 30 and 60 is 45. But finding the moral mean is dependent upon the needs and capacities of an individual. It will be different given the needs and situations people find themselves in. To use Aristotle's own example, granted, we may undereat or overeat. We might take too much or too little pleasure in food, and our actions may be deficient or excessive. But the mean is not the same. For example, the wrestler Myron, a champion wrestler of Aristotle's day, as it would be for the philosopher Socrates. Even so, both would be subject to excesses and deficiencies, that is to say, a degree of undereating and overeating, with the virtue of health marked by finding the middle or mean between the two. Second, apart from finding the mean as varying according to different individuals, means also vary according to different situations. In the case of fear, fear from a possible street fight demands one set of skills. Fear in public speaking will be handled by another set of skills and habits, mountain climbing by yet another. But again, even though being courageous will require vastly different skills and habits in different kinds of situations, they will still observe the same pattern of finding the mean between too much and too little. A mountain climber can be reckless just as a street fighter can. Third point, Aristotle thought that the moral life was a work in progress. As we grow and mature, we learn our weaknesses and our strengths. Perhaps we realize we're too quick to be angry, or too unassertive in arguments, or too loose, or too stingy with our money. In effect, as we mature, we understand our own weaknesses when we tend to overshoot or undershoot the mean. Our own happiness then requires a kind of maturity that we make, which means making adjustments in relationship to the mean. So doing, we continue to develop our character, and from a virtue ethics point of view, we become moral human beings. Fourth and last, there's another vitally significant reason for hitting the moral mean. Being courageous, generous, or even-tempered not only grounds the conditions of a person's happiness, it also helps the people she or he associates with. The virtues are good for both the people who possess them and the people around them. Consider, the courageous person saves the bystanders threatened by the violent intruder. The associates of the fair person are likely to be treated justly and are better for the fair person's virtue. So there's additional boon in behaving virtuously. It helps not only the person who has virtues, but the person affected by them. To put the matter in current terms, current slogans, virtues instill a win-win affair. Both the virtuous person and their associates are better for them. So far, we've briefly considered Aristotle's account of moral virtues. Let's move on now and make some connection here with how virtue ethics applies to business and the professions. First, virtue ethics applies to management through the overlap between the person and the group. The just manager, the manager who takes reasonable risks, the even-tempered manager, the fair manager, they're going to be the respected managers because they're serving the group. They will tend to succeed insofar as they will be respected and supported by the people they work with. So virtue ethics applies directly to how people behave in a managerial position, not only because it will help their teams, but it will also promote their own success. Second, virtue ethics applies particularly well in the professions. Again, it's in the very nature of moral virtues that they're both good for the individuals and the people that are affected by them. In the case of the professions, the win-win aspect of the virtues not only strengthens the reputation of the individual, they maintain the strength of the profession as a whole. Consider the professions of accountancy and financial advising. Transparency amounts to a virtue within the accounting profession, surely. It's expected that a good accountant will strive to make the financials of an enterprise transparent. As we'd expect from the win-win nature of virtue ethics, the virtue of transparency in financial statements is good both for the reputation of the accountant as well as for the credibility of the accounting profession. Accountants' professional status collapses if their financial reports cannot be trusted. In the 1990s, when the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the so-called AICPA, lobbied hard to protect accountants' rights both to audit their clients as well as to provide financial consulting for their clients, they were in effect undermining the standards of their professions. Why? The goals of financial consulting easily come into conflict with the virtue of transparency in accounting. Supposing financial advisors want to make their clients' stock look good, they are very tempted to hide some of its weaker financials. But what if the financial advisor is also the client's auditor? A situation the AICPA lobbied hard to allow in the 1990s. The financial advisor's goals are easily at cross purposes with the auditors, since as auditors, they have an obligation to make weak financials transparent. What should the financial consultant, who's also an auditor, do? This is precisely the problem that giant accounting firms such as Arthur Andersen found themselves in the 1990s. Arthur Andersen's top management knew that if they started telling the whole truth about their clients' financials, they would lose extremely lucrative contracts. So they hid the dirty books of companies such as Sunbeam, Waste Management, Enron, Global Crossing, Quest, and WorldCom, to mention the short list, and retained their role as their financial accountants. Arthur Andersen's upper management, in effect, disregarded the virtues of the accounting profession. As a result, they undermined the integrity of their company, and to some extent, they cast suspicion on the U.S. accounting profession as a whole. This is the pattern of virtue ethics in general. Recall that virtue ethics leads to an agreement between the individual and the group. In the case of Arthur Andersen, the upshot was this former accounting giant was put out of business. To an extent, they also accelerated the downfall of CEOs and top management personnel of companies such as Enron and WorldCom. The downfall of these corporate behemoths is now well known. Some of the longest jail time sentences for white-collar crime that have ever been handed out were handed out recently. Jeff Skilling, former president of Enron, was sentenced to in 2006 to 24 years, 4 months of prison time. Bernard Ebbers, former CEO of WorldCom, 25 years. John Regas, founder and CEO of Adelphia, 15 years. Mark Schwartz, former CFO of Tyco, 8 to 25 years. Quite a price to pay, and their families as well, for ethical misjudgments. Because the work of professionals rely on the upholding of virtues, for example, competent caretaking in the health professions, professionals can't afford to disregard the specific virtues that are proper to their expertise. Just as accounting needs to be transparent or the profession will no longer serve its function, similarly, healthcare professionals need to be informed and competent, or we are better off never visiting a doctor's office. There is a simple test for judging whether an action is ethical or not within a virtue ethics perspective. It's sometimes called the disclosure rule. The suitability of this rule follows from the win-win aspect of virtue ethics. The test is easily done. It's a kind of thought experiment. Imagine the action, motives, or behavior in question is broadcasted by the media outlet that you would consider your harshest moral critic. Consider it on the front page of, say, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, your school newspaper, CNN, or maybe the worst, a family album. It's not that such publications embody the gold standard of morality. For many, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, mentioned before, the AICPA, was the gold standard for ethics in accounting. And in fact, it was precisely the AICPA that abetted the undoing of Arthur Andersen and other firms. The disclosure rule works because exposing your action through a media outlet appeals to the moral principles of the group in question. The newspaper that would be the harshest critic, in a sense, honors the best principles of the group. There's one last topic that we'll address in considering how virtue ethics applies to business and the professions. The master virtue among virtues in general is integrity. As the root of the word integrity indicates, integrity implies being whole. This applies in general to virtue ethics inasmuch as the question is, to what extent is the whole person involved? And personal integrity is by no means the rule. Social anthropologists have long asserted that it's normal to have multiple selves. Children certainly behave differently when playing with younger friends than with older friends, when addressing their parents or in church or in temples or in mosques or synagogues. How you behave with your elderly professor is not how you would behave with your little brother or sister. And it's not just a question of making passing adjustments. A romantic liaison brings out a different part of yourself than the self called upon to understand and to do problems in a calculus textbook. As a result, virtue ethics must take into account the degree of integrity or wholeness of a person's personality. As we'll see in our discussion of Kenneth Lay and the fall of Enron, one side of Kenneth Lay was admirably friendly, persevering, philanthropic, and humble. But another part was arrogant, cutthroat, authoritarian, and merciless. His curious double-sided nature surely served his rise to power. It very likely also prompted his ruin. One last word. The propensity of multiple selves and the problem of integrity has a very significant consequence in regard to hiring, promotion, and discipline. The very propensity of human beings to have multiple selves makes virtuous behavior at school, church, or at family not necessarily indicative of work performance. Like Kenneth Lay, a person may be a model father and husband. This was true, for example, of Dennis Levine, who was arrested and imprisoned for insider trading in the 1980s. Levine's spouse and family, living in a small one-bedroom apartment, saw him as an ideal father and husband. They had no idea that he was making huge illegal insider trading profits. Because of the problem of multiple selves, an assessment of a person's virtue should be directed to their work behavior. Not only does judging the employee's behavior outside of their work intrude upon their privacy, it can also deceive us into thinking that the good behavior at home means good behavior at work. Because of the complexity of human selves, this inference cannot reasonably be drawn. Let us review then the main points of this lecture. 1. Virtue ethics, unlike consequence-based ethics or duty-based ethics, is based on certain character traits, such as courage, even-temperedness, fairness. These traits indicate habitual modes of behavior. Aristotle, a founder of virtue ethics, reasoned that certain virtues would be needed for a happy life. A third point. Aristotle based his reasoning on the pervasiveness of certain moods and feelings, such as fear, confidence, taking pleasure in food and drink, anger, shame, justice. A fourth point. Since these human feelings may be felt too much or too little, Aristotle reasoned there must be a middle or mean between the excess and deficiency. These means are the human virtues. Fifth point. Aristotle understood that these virtues could be refined and strengthened over a lifetime. As people increasingly understood their strengths and weaknesses, they would make more efforts and would more accurately hit the mean. Sixth point, Aristotle also understood that the lasting power of virtues depended on their being valuable for both individuals and the groups they're associated with. Virtue ethics applies in general to managerial behavior. The virtues lead to the way a manager's respect and increasing cooperation of the people they work with transpires. As a result, it benefits both the teams as well as the manager's career. Eighth point, virtue ethics applies especially in the professions. They depend upon maintaining excellences in human behavior, and in order to gain the trust of their clients and patients, these virtues must be followed.
Go.
9. In virtue ethics, moral behavior may be tested by the disclosure rule. 10. The work of cultural anthropologists has indicated that it is normal for people to have multiple selves. Consequently, the master virtue of integrity is key in virtue ethics. 11. Since people normally have multiple selves, in business ethics we need to be concerned with whether a person's behavior is virtuous in the workplace. We neither can nor should extrapolate from virtuous behavior with family, friends at home to the workplace. One need not follow from the other.